it is my honor to introduce Frank Gaffney. He's the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. He's the founder and executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy, president and CEO of Save the Persecuted Christians. Under President Reagan, he acted as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy, served as chairman of the high-level group, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy. He's the lead author of several books. He hosts the Daily Secure Freedom Minute, heard on 200 stations coast to coast, featured contributor to Breitbart, and one of the more hated people according to Southern Poverty Law Center, which endears him particularly to us. So Frank, welcome. So glad you're here. And should I click over?
Your team, and I feel it's really our team because you've been so gracious. I've had a chance to be out there as recently as, back before there was a lockdown, as a matter of fact.
Right.
Well, like it was yesterday. Anyway, it's a delight to have a chance to talk with you about a subject that I'm passionate about, which is, interestingly enough, very much at the intersection of the existential threat to freedom, which is the focus of this brief, but also the persecution of Christians. It's happening on an immense scale in communist China. We'll talk about some of the technologies that are being brought to bear for that purpose in the course of these remarks. If you'll bring up the first screen, I'll just mention that this term, existential threat to freedom, is one that my old boss, Ronald Reagan, used going back to the early 1960s, because he understood that we're on an arc of history that didn't begin in our time and isn't going to end in it, at least we think not. And in particular, it's involved a struggle for freedom. And I don't know if you're seeing this slide deck. I'm not, Karen, at the
Hold
moment.
on, I'm getting there.
Okay.
How's that?
That's it. That's the ticket. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Karen. Thank you for administering this.
We'll see how this goes. Okay.
Anyway, there should be a
minimize
slide.
that.
President Reagan.
How's that? There we go. All right. We've
Now
got this going here.
So the president, when he was not even the governor of California, I believe, initially put forth the proposition that we don't pass on freedom through the bloodstream, and that we would, in fact, rue the day if we don't step up and ensure that we pass it on properly, that we have to tell our children and our children's children what it was like to live in the United States when men were free. So we're here out of a shared commitment, I know, to prevent that from happening. And we'll go to the next slide because we've got an interesting case study of how this can actually be transformative when we step up to that job of protecting freedom against existential threats. This, of course, is a country that no longer exists, thanks God. It is the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as they called it. Next slide. And there was a period in our nation's history when successive administrations, Republican and Democratic, thought that the right response to the Soviet Union was to engage in what came to be called détente, a kind of engagement, if you will, but détente was the title for it, a fancy French word, that basically translated into, we'll give them what they want and they may not leave, they may leave us alone if we do that. This was not something that sat well with some, but it was, in fact, I was on Steve Bannon's program this morning for a special that we've just taped about the work of the Committee on the Present Danger China, and he really reminded me and the audience that there was a time when the kind of narratives and ideas and policies that these gentlemen pursued were considered to be so, well, indisputably true that anybody who defied that view was outside of the mainstream, to say the least, if not a dangerous cowboy, for example. Next slide, Karen. Among the community of people who thought differently, interestingly enough, were Jews and some Christians, but I think principally Jews. Several of our members of the audience have some background in Pittsburgh, as do I, and I remember seeing this particular sign, or one very like it, outside a temple that I used to go past practically every day to go to school in Pittsburgh, called the Tree of Life Synagogue. And it's of course become quite renowned of late due to a terrible attack that took place there. But at the time, this sign just mystified me what that was about. Confusing, as I think a lot of people did, Jewry with jewelry when they said save Soviet Jewry. Right. Thought, what could possibly be wrong with those jewels? Well, this was about, of course, the repression that was very, very badly being meted out to the Jews in the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. And signs like this began to create a movement of people who believed that the Soviets needed to be held accountable. This was one of their big rallies on Fifth Avenue. It's not anybody on Fifth Avenue at the moment, of course, but back in the day, this was still a pretty big deal. It was a real force. And the next slide, please. My old boss, another of them, was a fellow by the name of Henry Scoop Jackson, a United States senator, who basically took the political power that that movement represented, and he translated it into political leverage. Specifically, he set about trying to ensure that the Soviets would not get something it turned out they not only wanted, but desperately needed, namely most favored nation status, unless they let the Jews go. And for that matter, anybody else who wanted to leave. Next slide. This was a problem. And I'll just segue from the other to this. This was a problem because the Soviets wouldn't have it. They weren't going to let anybody out. If they let anybody out, they'd have to let lots of people out. So they did not, in fact, support the implementation of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. They didn't get the most favored nation status. And that set the stage for this particular group. The Committee on the Present Danger was essentially something that was initially begun in the 1950s. In the mid-1970s, it took on a new life because, as I said, there were a small group of people, relatively speaking, who thought propping up the Soviet Union was probably ill-advised. And when they didn't get the most favored nation status, they didn't get all of the benefits that they thought might accrue. And this group started saying, you know, we actually need a different strategy, a different approach, because what they're doing with what resources they have was very dangerous, building up immense numbers of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and submarines and so on, and expanding their footprint around the world in a way that was very much at odds with our interests. So this group of national security practitioners, subject matter experts, business leaders, religious freedom advocates, human rights champions, essentially came together, and one of their members, next slide, was this fellow who became very keen on getting their help as a pickup team, as I say, in defining an alternative strategy to détente. Next slide. He essentially put that proposition before the American people in 1980, and next slide. Some 31 of the people who were members of the committee wound up going into his administration. Here are four of the most prominent, as they began to help the president, who had gotten a mandate for an alternative to détente, to begin executing the strategy. And as they say, the rest is history. Next slide. The plan, been called the Divine Plan by some, involved some others, notably John Paul II, also Margaret Thatcher. And it did indeed bring down the evil empire, freeing not only Jews, by the way, but hundreds of millions of other people who had been enslaved by successive totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union. Next slide, which is all by way of saying that in the face of existential threat to freedom, even small numbers of people can make a difference. So a small pickup team, very like the previous one, has come together under the rubric of what we call the Committee on the Present Danger China. As Karen mentioned, I'm the vice chairman of it. Brian Kennedy is our chairman. He was with us when we were out in LA talking about these subjects with you all 2 months ago, I guess now. And we've begun seeing what we can do in much the same way to articulate what the nature of the Chinese Communist Party threat is and develop strategies for countering it in ways that we think are going to be necessary to protect this country and freedom more generally from the existential threat that the CCP presents. Next slide. That threat was, interestingly enough, forecast very nicely for us, if we have the wit to simply study it, in a book that came to be called in English, Unrestricted Warfare. I believe the Chinese title is The Plan to Destroy America. It was written by two senior Chinese colonels in 1999, and it enumerates 20 or so different techniques that the Chinese Communist Party could use until such time as it had the power to use violence effectively against the United States to take it down. And I'm going to talk about a number of the ways in which those prescriptions have actually now been adopted and implemented for, in some cases, decades. Next slide. It really goes back to this fellow. I don't know if you're of an age as I am to remember him, but he had this sort of diminutive quality about him that I think prompted a lot of people to think of him more as a koala bear or maybe panda cub rather than a very dangerous and indeed ruthless totalitarian in the tradition of Mao Zedong, but one who had decided that the strategy that needed to be followed, in fact, he told his party cadre back in 1991 that the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had ended and the Soviets had lost. And with that, a new Cold War was beginning that the Chinese and the United States were going to be in and China would win in. So he developed this strategy, very much riddled with deception. It came to be known as the hide and bide strategy. And it basically laid out how the Chinese Communist Party would engage, not détente, but engage the United States in ways that were deceptively friendly and inviting of cooperation. Again, the theory being that if we just help the Chinese become richer, they would be good partners in the international community, etc. Strategic deception and strategic patience, the two operative words here. Next slide, Karen. And just as with détente, you see here how successive US governments of both parties, again, embrace this idea. Initially as the China card to be used against the Soviet Union. That was something that my boss, Scoop Jackson, was very enamored of as an idea. But over time, it became lubricated by immense amounts of money that prompted people, capitalists, political figures, and the like, to think that this is going to be great. We'll not only engage in cooperation with them and have a sort of benign attitude towards this Communist Party, but we will actually enable them to have very preferential trade arrangements, even before they became partners in the WTO, that they would be able to get access to our markets, they would be able to sell inexpensive products here, they would be able thereby to essentially begin a substantial transformation of our industrial base and our economy by making it highly dependent on China. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Next slide, Karen. So with the departure of Deng Xiaoping some time ago and the succession of subsequent general secretaries of the Communist Party, we saw all of that cooperation and engagement and partnership and so on immensely increasing the wealth, the economic strength, and increasingly the military power of Chinese communism. And lo and behold, a few years back, this fellow turned up, Xi Jinping, and he's gotten to the point where he has believed that it's no longer necessary to hide or really bide so much, that it's now time for China to begin asserting itself on the world stage, at least up to the point where this coronavirus kicked in. We'll talk about how that's been playing out in a moment. But he was rather much more direct about his China dream, as he calls it, that would result in the Chinese people achieving their historic place in the world once again, the center of the universe, as they say, the middle kingdom, and the dominant power, in other words. Next slide. Now, there's this natty little problem about this virus. I think you're all aware that this virus emanated from Wuhan, China. There's now increasing evidence, as Senator Tom Cotton said yesterday on Fox News, that essentially all, he put it, the circumstantial evidence points to it emanating from one of two biological warfare-related facilities in Wuhan, two laboratories, one a biolevel 4 facility, the other biolevel 2. It's not entirely clear how that came about. There's an open question, and apparently it's under investigation from the president whether it was done intentionally by the Chinese Communist Party. But what we do know is what has happened since they learned that they had a pandemic-capable disease unleashed on the people of China. Next slide. And as I mentioned in this interview with Maria yesterday, Senator Cotton said very explicitly that what the Chinese did when they knew about the dangers, but nobody else did, was they began deliberately, consciously, and malevolently to move it offshore. As he said, to essentially assure that everybody else was going to suffer if China did. Mm-hmm. And as the University of Southampton has pointed out, the fact that they did that, or simply didn't even tell anybody else really what was going on for several weeks, caused perhaps as many as 95% of the infections and losses to have been sustained unnecessarily. And I think, to the senator's point, this was very intentional. This makes it, I believe, a crime against humanity of epic proportions, for which the Chinese should be held accountable. Next slide. It's certainly been a teachable moment, if we have the wit to pay attention to it, in terms of what these guys are up to. I think most of us feel a very high level of resentment towards the Chinese at this point. When I say the Chinese, I really mean the Chinese Communist Party. It's not necessarily aimed at individual citizens or the population writ large of China, but it is the Chinese Communist Party virus, I believe, and it has been inflicted upon us by the Chinese Communist Party, and to the senator's point, intentionally so. Now, how is that being read by the American people? Next slide. Well, we did a poll with Committee on Present Danger China as the sponsor back in the end of January. I believe one of the best pollsters in the country is John McLaughlin. He happens to be President Trump's pollster. But he went into the field with a series of 46 or 7, I think, questions of likely voters, 1,000 likely voters. And he came up with some really stunning insights into how people felt, again, before the pandemic became the preoccupation that it has of late. Next slide. And these are sort of the bottom, the money questions, if you will. Are you worried about these guys? And the answer was very lopsidedly yes. And that was true of basically every single one of the questions. Oh, well, it was yes or no, but the majority were very robust about China, very concerned about it. The more they learned in the course of the questions, the more concerned they typically became. But the really interesting thing to me is that this wasn't just sort of the average. This was something that was true virtually across all of the demographics. Before the pandemic, people were very sensible in this poll, at least, about the challenge. And by the way, it was modeling the population of the electorate in the 2016 election. So I think it was 44% Democrats, if memory serves, to only 39 Republicans. So this is saying something. And when you look at the subtabs, the crosstabs as they call them, it's even more impressive that this is really a view of China that is widely held. Now, interestingly enough, next slide, the Pew Research Center has just come out with its own poll, taken, I think, throughout basically the month of March. And their findings were very similar, only more so, to the point where 90% roughly of the people they polled, and these weren't voters, these were just American adults, came back and said they were very concerned about what China is up to. And they regard some 62% of them regard it as a major threat to us. So that's not entirely surprising given what we've been through. But again, let me just show you the next slide. They found the same thing when you look at the crosstabs or the demographic subgroups. Very, very strong unanimity against at least several of these major categories. So why is this important? Well, it's important because when you look at what the Chinese are up to now, we have a receptivity on the part of the American people to learning more about it and to, I think, insist that the Chinese be held accountable. So next slide. I just want to go through, and I'll do this fairly quickly. 5 of the most worrying of what I think of as sort of threat vectors that the Chinese Communist Party is pursuing. Some of them very directly taken out of the playbook of those colonels who wrote Unrestricted Warfare. Some of them they've improvised since, but it's very much in keeping with the idea that the United States is communist China's main impediment to realizing its objective of world domination. And it intends to ensure that that obstacle is removed, whatever it takes. So we'll start with the trade practices. Next slide. You've heard a lot about this, of course. President Trump, to his credit, has really made a point of elevating this as an issue long before the present problem. And he's done so by highlighting dumping and currency manipulation, the extent to which they've denied us access to their market, even as they've exploited access to ours. They've stolen, by some estimates, 500 to 600 billion dollars a year in intellectual property from the United States. They have pursued, as I say, predatory practices like building cartels or otherwise dominating certain critical sectors. Rare earth minerals is just one example. And in the process, essentially giving themselves a market advantage over their competitors, including, by the way, with respect to components. It's no longer just raw materials. It's finished products, some of them very, very highly advanced. We'll talk more about that in a minute. They've been buying up stuff in our country. Alibaba was one of the Chinese companies that came to the US capital market, brought the largest IPO in Wall Street history up to that point. I think it garnered something on the order of $25 billion. And much of that money was plowed back into buying up seed corn technology operations in the United States to their benefit and our detriment. And then there's this issue, which we've been hearing a lot about lately, next slide, in connection with medicine, of the supply chain dependencies that have been created by, well, capitalists and governments who were indifferent to the national security or even public safety implications of this. One of our colleagues at the Committee on the Present Danger China is a wonderful contributor by the name of Rosemary Gibson. She's the co-author of this book, China RX. You may be familiar with it. It is chilling. And the fact that she wrote it 2 years ago and nothing was done to correct our dependency on China for virtually all of our medicines is scandalous. Next slide. It's just one of the many points. And in a way, again, it's a microcosm of this larger problem. It's generics, it's active pharmaceutical ingredients, it's penicillin, it's aspirin, it's vitamin C, for heaven's sakes, all of which have now become essentially Chinese dominated product lines. And if they, next slide, do either of two things, it's a problem. If they adulterate them, as they've been known to do with a lot of other things, from chips to drywall to baby formula and dog food to medicine, that can be lethal. In fact, people in this country, as Rosemary's documented, have died using a product like heparin, a popular blood thinner that comes from China and has been found to, in sub-batches, have rocket fuel in it, which may thin your blood, but it generally does some bad things to you besides. And then there's the problem, which has been rooted in the connection with this pandemic, that they would just simply cut us off altogether. It hasn't, I think, happened entirely yet, but I think we've had a hard time certainly getting masks and gowns and other paraphernalia, but I think also some medicines as well. Next slide. So turning from the predatory trade practices to this phenomenon, what I really think of as a hegemonic colonial infrastructure building operation dubbed the Belt and Road Initiative by Xi Jinping. I'm not sure this map is up to date, honestly. I think there are more countries even that are reflected in the blue that have become aligned with the Chinese in one way or another to have them present in their countries, have them building infrastructure, often on credit. And that's been a problem, next slide, because it turns out that like payday loans, debt trap financing has turned this infrastructure build out, ports, airfields, road systems, rail systems, digital infrastructure as well. We'll talk more about it in a minute. The 5G system, so-called fifth generation telecommunications, all of this has been going into these countries on credit card. In most cases, the countries in question typically can't make the payments. China forecloses. These assets become theirs, or at least are under their control, and they're used to give China dominance in the countries in question, and in some cases at least project power from those countries to our considerable detriment. So this is a second of the threat vectors that is very worrying. And I think one of the things that has happened, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, as a result of both the debt trap problem and the pandemic, is a lot of countries that have signed up are having buyer's remorse in a big way. And that's an opportunity for us. Next slide. There's the old-fashioned power metric of the military kind. This is a photograph that was taken in Tiananmen Square during the 70th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the People's Republic. An awful lot of ordnance was on display there. An awful lot more is on display around the world, at sea, in the air, on land, of course, increasingly in other places besides. But just staying with this for a moment, next slide. A very important piece of how this has come about is that China has been able to simply steal, as I mentioned, intellectual property, including classified weapons designs that they have used to build out this force at a fraction of the cost that it's taken us and much less time, simply because they are actually taking advantage of the investment we're making in the research and development. They're just going directly to production and sometimes making improvements on it, but mostly just essentially avoiding huge costs that we have to bear. One particular area of interest to me, going back to my time in the Pentagon, as Karen mentioned, nuclear capabilities. I find this really fascinating as just an example of the magnitude of what we're dealing with here. I'm an alumnus of Georgetown University, and I'm proud of a professor there who was a colleague of mine in the Reagan Pentagon by the name of Phil Carber. Phil assigned his undergraduate and graduate students a couple of years back to do a study, just see what they could figure out, using just open sources, of course, about something that has come to be called the underground Great Wall of China. So-called because it involves 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels in which we believe the Chinese Communist Party has placed, well, it's anybody's guess really, but large numbers of ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons on them. Concealed from view, as I say, we don't know how many there are, we certainly don't know where they are. It's a secure deployment system and one that is conducive in their hands to a first strike against this country. But I mention it principally because we're often told by specialists that the Chinese have only 200 or 300, maybe 400 nuclear weapons in their entire arsenal. Well, it's simply not credible that you would go to the lengths, to say nothing of the expense, of building 3,000 miles of tunnels to hide a couple hundred warheads. So we're dealing with an adversary that is formidable, that is employing immense amounts of money to build up a real capability in the conventional space, the non-conventional space, and some asymmetric means as well that are very worrying in a lot of places, as I mentioned, around the world. Next slide. This brings us to the issue of asymmetric capabilities. These are just four that I'm going to touch on again very quickly, but they're illustrative of how China, going back to the time of this book, if not well before, was thinking about, well, we call it outside the box, thinking about how they could use asymmetric means to obtain dominant military positions. And it's a very interesting case study, just these four. So bear with me as I rattle them off. They're illustrative of what they're doing in other areas as well. First up, the electromagnetic spectrum. This slide may be particularly familiar to people on the call who are in California. It's a photograph of our electric grid essentially coming down at our own hands. Karen, there you go. In the fire, PG&E's infrastructure has been burning up with some regularity. Among other things, it's burning up a lot of the rest of the real estate too. But the Chinese have a doctrine that says we will take out the grid of the United States. We will use electromagnetic pulse, we will use cyber means, we will use physical sabotage. And even if none of that happens, either at their hands or the North Koreans or the Iranians or the Russians, there is this other problem that Mother Nature is likely to deliver a similar kind of electromagnetic pulse attack, only of a natural kind. Any one of which would essentially, in fairly short order, if it's widespread and sustained, take down this country. By some estimates, 90% of us wouldn't make it. The Chinese understand that and have been beavering away at perfecting the means by which to deliver such attacks. Next slide. Space. We'll be hearing more and more in the days and years ahead about China's space activities. Not so much about their military character, which is very much what they're about, but usually in the context of their sort of civilian exploration and daring do, putting a rover on the backside of the moon, for example, has a lot of very interesting military applications, and you can bet that's what's prompted the Chinese to do it. They envision denying us the use of space. They recognize that if they control the high frontier, as it's been called, they will dominate what goes on the earth below as well. Next slide. I should just mention this Earth-Moon system. They describe it as is aimed at really having control of not just the Earth, but also that space between the Earth and the Moon. Next slide. Just in the shortest of short forms, I would commend to you Newt Gingrich's new book about China. He makes the point that the stakes are unbelievably high with respect to who decides the future character of telecommunications. And right now, the Chinese have the leading position in that race. Remains to be seen whether we can get our act together in time, but the hour is very late, and I think it is right to call attention to it. The possibilities of using such telecommunications means and the kind of data that will be moving and the kind of information that they'll have access to say nothing of the ability to control the so-called Internet of Things through 5G, all have national security implications as well as privacy and commercial ones. Next slide. Information and influence operations are things that we generally just don't pay much attention to in this country. I think it's one of the lasting legacies of the Cold War that the Soviets were brilliantly successful when they took out, effectively, Joe McCarthy. Most of what we know or think we know about Joe McCarthy is not true. He actually was right, but he was so successfully defamed that his name to this day is associated with lunatic conspiracy theories and particularly a misplaced fear of the enemy within. Well, interestingly enough, on the show this weekend with Maria Bartiromo, Senator Cotton talked a bit as well, that other point about the Chinese deliberately attacking us with this virus. Senator Cotton expressed his concern about Chinese students in this country, making the perfectly accurate point that they are used by Chinese intelligence services to collect information, proprietary secrets, research information, and otherwise to dominate Chinese students on college campuses through their Confucius Institutes and through other means in ways that are inimical to the kind of understanding of China and useful application of academic resources to our effort to defend our country against it. So when you put all this together, Confucius Institutes, the United Front influence operations, the fellow travelers, there was a very interesting comment on Tucker Carlson 2 or 3 weeks ago, I guess now, by a fellow by the name of Brian Dean Wright, to really commend you. He was asked, as a former CIA officer and a Democrat, by Tucker, what did he make of the attitude of the Democratic Party and its leaders towards China? And he basically said, well, there are 3 explanations for it. One is that they're useful idiots. Another is that they've got some sort of relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And a third he allowed may be that they're just actually agents of Chinese intelligence. Now, I didn't say it. I'd catch hell for doing it, but he did. And I think there's reason to believe that there are some of all of those people. In fact, I know one of Karen's dear friends, as is mine, and a great resource to AFA is Trevor Loudon. And I had Trevor on our radio show the other day, and he did a fabulous job of talking about the extent to which the Democratic Party has been deeply penetrated and compromised by the Chinese and other communists. And it's food for thought. It really is. Joe McCarthy would be spinning at a very high RPM in his grave over the degree to which this actually is now a case of enemies within that makes what he was concerned about pale into insignificance. Next slide. Which brings me to this issue, which is extremely topical. Everything that I've shared with you, I believe it's fair to say, has been made possible because we have been underwriting. We've done this going back to what I was saying earlier about engagement, détente, if you will, in this time with this country. Nobody embraced the idea of engagement more assiduously, arguably, than has Wall Street. By some estimates, $3 trillion has migrated from our debt and equities markets to communist China. Much of it invested in companies that are problematic in the extreme. For one thing, not a one of these Chinese companies, and there are about 1,000 of them in our markets now, not a one of them conforms to our statutory requirements for transparency, accountability, governance issues, or even material risk disclosure. We are actually now being buffeted, even before this meltdown over the pandemic in China, by information about companies that just are not financially viable. And yet Americans are having their personal savings, their retirement funds in many cases, or other investments entrusted to the not so tender mercies of these Chinese Communist Party companies. One example of the problem is a pharmaceutical company. I mentioned that we're heavily dependent on Chinese pharmaceutical manufacturers now. One of them reported last year that $4.4 billion had gone missing, quote unquote. Even their own ineffectual Securities and Exchange Commission acknowledged, of course, after the horse was out of the barn, that this was an example of fraud and malfeasance. But who knows how many other companies are similarly in desperate financial straits. Nobody on Wall Street apparently is doing any due diligence into any of these companies. And you might ask, well, how does the SEC allow this to happen? And the answer appears to be they've simply accommodated the Chinese insistence that such considerations as accountability and governance and risk are state secrets. And therefore they need not disclose them. Well, I actually think that's the first clue that there's probably something wrong here.
Indeed.
When you're dealing with state secrets. But here's the other part of this, folks, which is particularly infuriating. And just today, literally, we released a letter. Maybe Karen, I can send this on to you for your help in getting it out to the people who've participated in this call. But it's a very powerful letter signed by 134 individuals, many of them senior military or civilian former officials, some business leaders, some religious leaders, some human rights activists and the like, who have come together to warn against the latest harebrained scheme on the part of these Wall Street capitalists, namely to begin investing the retirement funds of military personnel and US government civilian employees, past and present, in an index that the Morgan Stanley product, that's now an independent company, MSCI, All Country World ex-US Index. It is a fancy term for an index that now has 11% of its holdings in Chinese companies of the kind I've just mentioned. And oh, by the way, among them are companies that are helping with the persecution of Uyghurs and other Chinese citizens with their social credit system and the security surveillance apparatus that accompanies it over in those concentration camps in Xinjiang, for example, and elsewhere. In fact, every city in China now has hundreds of millions of these cameras countrywide. Others of the companies are companies that have been sanctioned by the United States government, either for human rights abuses or national security ones. It is, in short, illegal to do business with those companies, but you can still invest in them. And then there's the problem that some of these companies are actually involved in building weapon systems that will be used to kill our men and women in uniform, and perhaps others of us as well. I must tell you, I consider it not simply crazy, but actually obscene that we're at a position where, thanks to this appetite on the part of these Wall Street folks primarily, and their connivance with people that have been managing this thrift savings plan, as it's called, to a point where we're going to see those in the pension system of the federal government who want to have a diversified portfolio with some international shares having no choice but to invest in companies like those that I've just mentioned. The point being that this is actually, to use the old Leninist phrase or paraphrase of it, a case of lending the Chinese Communist Party the money to buy the rope with which they will hang the capitalists.
Wow.
And I simply think this is so unacceptable. Unfortunately, 134 others have done as well. And I believe that we're now finally getting the attention of the senior leadership of the United States government, because we've got serious people now saying this is totally unacceptable. And the amazing thing is, when you think about it, you look at every public government, on the civilian side or the military side, they're all going to have their money put into these kinds of companies. So this ought to be personal as well as in the national interest. Next slide, Karen, please. So just now to wrap up very quickly, and I've gone on frightfully long. I thank you for bearing
Not
with
at
me.
all. This is fabulous. Frank.
This is a short summary of what I've shared. It is an existential threat. It's the ambition of the Chinese Communist Party to be the dominant power. They've been waging unrestricted warfare against us for at least 30 years now. They have pursued vectors of attack that are debilitating to us economically, that are undermining our domestic security, that have now endangered our public health, and that could well ultimately devastate this country altogether. And we have a unique opportunity, I believe, right now, thanks to this pandemic, thanks to Donald Trump being in the White House, thanks to the sentiment that is clearly now abroad in the body politic and our elected representatives, to do something about this. So what should we be doing? Next slide. We are trying as a committee, as we did out in LA before the pandemic hit, to really raise awareness about the sorts of things that I've shared with you here today, to encourage people to take this kind of information aboard and to heart, and to thereby shape, as our predecessors did in 1980, the policy battle space. It's sometimes hard to remember that we actually have an election going on at the moment, but we do. And for the reasons that I mentioned with this polling, it's clear that what people were saying before the pandemic in our poll, and I believe even more so now in the Pew poll, namely that this is going to be a voting issue. China is now on people's mind, and what we have to do about it, I think, is as well. And so we're working on trying to both encourage a mandate to be given for a much more robust policy approach towards China, and to lay out the elements of what that would entail. So last slide, I believe, is the next one. We want to make sure that we're dealing with this holistically. It's a lot of talk about a whole of government, whole of society is really what's needed, because the whole of society is under assault. We believe that disengagement from China, not more engagement with China, is in order. It won't be done overnight, but I think some important steps have already begun to be taken, notably by getting our supply chains out of China. If we do nothing else, we need to stop underwriting the threat. I think this thrift savings plan, sort of microcosmic example, is an obvious place to start. And if we can turn that off, it could happen at any time now. The money could migrate into Chinese companies literally any day now. But I've had calls even today from senior administration people inquiring about what to do in this case. I think if that is going to be acted upon, if they hear more from folks like yourselves and others who'll be hopefully tuning into this program over time, or are otherwise following the work of the Committee on the Present Danger of China at presentdangerchina.org, or simply paying attention to the world that's unfolding around us, we will see the thrift savings plan kept out of the Chinese clutches. And by so doing, to begin to create an environment in which Wall Street actually thinks about investing patriotically in things that would make a difference to the strengthening of our country, instead of investing in the strengthening of our enemy. I think I'll just wrap up by saying these are the sorts of things that, if we do nothing else, we look to the Chinese for, examples of how you can fight, short of the kinetic, hopefully, this sort of war. And that last bullet about information and influence operations, I remember vividly, going back to the first of the slides, working for President Reagan, the power of his, well, political warfare against
Mhm.
the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. He really took to heart what Scoop Jackson and what the Save Soviet Jewry campaigners did, that it was an evil empire,
Mhm.
as he put it. And if we were to talk about the Chinese Communist Party as Evil Empire 2.0 and deal with it as such, I think we would begin making major strides in the direction that we have to go, which is to decouple and strengthen our own country against this existential threat to freedom. So with that, I'll close. If you might put up the last slide if people want to find out more information. This is a project of the Center for Security Policy, which, as Karen mentioned, I had the privilege of founding a long time ago. And Fred Fleitz, our current president and CEO, is very supportive of this committee on the present danger of China. I'm very proud of it, and we would love to have your help with it. I'm happy to talk to you about how and any other questions you have at this point.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was unbelievably and terrifyingly comprehensive. When we
I
had
only
you,
scratched the surface, Karen, I'm
I
afraid.
know. You had reached out to AFA to me. I think it was February before the virus, everything, and said, I have a new
Gig.
new threat, a new gig, a new concern, not maybe a new concern, but a new project that I'm working on about China. And you did put it in the context of how it was existential on so many fronts. And you wanted to make sure that you got this message out to as many people as possible because it was an election issue and people needed to be aware. And then along comes the virus and eyes are open, which must be very heartening to you.
A slight
So
silver lining to an otherwise very bad cloud.
right, right. And when I guess we helped you put your event on March 1st, we were just starting to talk about all of this, and it was getting a little bit real, but boy, it wasn't anything as real as it is now. One of the things that came up, you had 4 speakers, and all of this is on your presentdanger.org website, the video of this.
PresentDangerChina.org.
Sorry, presentdanger.china.org. Thank you. Every one of the panelists, including you, said, thank goodness we have President Trump in office because he has been aware of the China threat for very long. This isn't a new thing to him. He's been on this. Does this give you confidence that these issues are being addressed with the gravitas and Reagan-esque seriousness that they should be?
Let me answer it this way, Karen. I think compared to what? Compared to all of his predecessors, and you saw those slides of successive ones, in some cases actually bowing
Yeah.
to the Chinese emperor. Donald Trump is a breath of fresh air and a much needed corrective. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that at least until this moment, Donald Trump felt very strongly, and understandably so, that the single most important consideration for his reelection was the strength of the economy.
Right.
And Wall Street's success was very much a factor in that. And I think he was very determined to try to assure that Wall Street was happy. And for the reasons that I've been talking to you about, I think people on Wall Street, I want to single out as a particular villain of this piece, as far as I'm concerned, a fellow by the name of Larry Fink. I call him Year of the Rat Fink, but whatever you want to think of him as, he is the 800-ton gorilla on Wall Street. He runs a company called BlackRock, which he founded. It has, I think, conservatively $7 trillion under management itself, and orders of magnitude more through its other companies that mirror what it's doing. Larry Fink is also the the guy whose firm manages the thrift savings plan. He is also the guy who has been telling the international community CEOs and our own that he intends to use BlackRock's power as an investor in lots and lots of companies to compel them through board action, if nothing else, to conform to Larry Fink's environment, social justice, and governance agenda, which may sound like virtue signaling, but for him, it's the Green New Deal. It's the whole hard left globalist agenda. And, you know, having guys like him with the power that he does in the private sector would be bad enough. But it's worse in a sense, Karen, that because, as President Trump put it the other day, he's one of the smartest guys in the world. The US government has decided to entrust Larry Fink with some portion of the $2 trillion that has just been conjured up to get us through this crisis. And the Federal Reserve is entrusting to his tender mercy something on the order of, well, I have no idea actually, but it's a good chunk, I believe, 4 facilities that have just been created for this crisis with some $4 trillion to play with. So you've got the private sector power, you've got the public sector power, you've got a radical leftist agenda, except interestingly enough, in this one sense. The last time I checked, the Chinese Communist Party was not good on environment, was not good on social governance, was not good on, social justice or governance, ES or G. So Larry Fink apparently doesn't have any trouble investing our money in a company that doesn't conform to his agenda. He wants everybody else to conform to it. The point being here that I think the deference that the president has exhibited towards some of these Wall Street guys might have been sensible or at least understandable before the pandemic. Now, it's no longer justified. And if anything, I think he needs to be much more mindful of how the American people feel rather than Chinese communists' friends in Wall Street. And how the American people feel is that we shouldn't be rewarding China for this pandemic. We should be punishing them for it. So that's my only caveat about how he's doing. And I'm hoping that he's going to see the wisdom of this and help stave off this thrift savings plan, in which case I think he'll be doing very much better than just about anybody else I can think of in government or out.
We are so lucky about the election in 2016 every day. Every day. I'm sure we all take a few moments to thank whoever we thank that we've got Donald Trump in the White House. Imperfections and all, thank God. You had mentioned before about union. Yes, we're funding communist China to build weaponry that can be used against us, but also our unions are deeply invested in China. It's incredibly pervasive, right?
Well, let me tell you a story. We talked about it when we were in California because it's a homeboy story in a fashion. The fellow who runs investments for the largest public employee fund in the country, the California Public Employees Fund, CalPERS, is a fellow by the name of Yu Ben Ming. And Yu Ben Ming has an interesting history. He worked for CalPERS for some time, and then he was recruited into something called the 1,000 Talents Program, which you may have heard of. It is essentially an intelligence recruitment operation for China. There's a guy who used to be the dean of or the chairman rather, of the chemistry department at Harvard University, who was arrested recently because he was engaged in this 1,000 Talents program and didn't tell the Defense Department, for whom he was also working, about it at the time. I think there have been several other academics. But Yu Ben Meng was not only recruited into that program. He left CalPERS for, I think, 2 or 3 years to go back and run the investments, I believe, for the foreign exchange reserve of communist China. And in the course of his time out there, he actually professed to one of the Chinese propaganda arms that it was the honor of a lifetime to work for the motherland. Now you ask yourself, what could possibly go wrong having a guy who feels that way running the investment strategy for the largest public employee retirement fund in the country? And I'll tell you what could go wrong. You could see the kind of ramping up of the investment that I don't know, $200 or $300 billion fund is making in Chinese communist companies.
Mhm.
Again, some of them human rights violators, some of them national security threats. This is outrageous to my way of thinking, but it hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves. So yes, unions are engaged. Gone are the days of George Meany and Lane Kirkland when they were playing a very important role with Ronald Reagan in bringing down the Soviet Union. They're playing for the other team now, I'm afraid, at least at the leadership level, not the members necessarily by any means.
And what we keep seeing are, I'm just shocked. I shouldn't be shocked. None of us should be shocked anymore, but Democrats seem at every possible decision point to be siding with the Chinese. What can you?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I think overwhelmingly, as Brian Dean Wright said on Tucker Carlson's show, I mentioned it a moment ago, at the leadership level,
Yeah.
the party apparatus, and an awful lot of the rank and file too. I think, look, let's face it, partly it's just they hate Trump so much that anybody who also hates Trump is going to be, on their side or
Right.
seem to be. But I think it's worse than that, unfortunately. Look, this is not going to be news to people who live behind enemy lines in California. The Democratic Party has become so radicalized, as Trevor Loudon's work documents, that you actually have people who are not just fellow travelers or witting enablers, but downright, democratic socialists, which means communists or indeed communists. And not only that, but they work assiduously to ensure that they are electing like-minded people. Joe Biden, Trevor gave me this hair-raising, if I had any, hair-raising account of Joe Biden's involvement going back to, his first run for the Senate with the Democratic Socialists in Delaware and elsewhere. And there's another party rubric under which it was being done too, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but check it out. Enemies Within is a fabulous book that Trevor did, and there's a movie by the same name. And the numbers of prominent people that you've heard of, that are in influential positions in our government, in the Congress now primarily. It's the kind of thing, again, that makes what you said a moment ago, Karen, so urgent.
Mm-hmm.
This election could entrust the country to such people. And that's ought to be very much something that is debated and worked through in this election cycle.
It is astounding. We have, aside from the big picture that you're talking about, Eric Garcetti, our mayor here, has said he's working with China to figure out how to reopen. It's stunning. De Blasio, same kind of thing. This isn't just sort of ignorance or, we flipped a coin. This is a deliberate coordination with not only our ideological enemy, not only the people who are creating the threat in every single way that you just described, but who also are the ones who unleashed exactly this problem that we're facing on us. We're looking to them.
Right. And just if I may,
stunning.
This is sort of, I guess, obvious, but when you look at this kind of outreach, it's also partly a function of what I was saying earlier, these influence operations. The Chinese would have us believe that communism is a cure for the coronavirus. And they want us to import their social credit system for monitoring our, healthcare system and who's had contact with whom and, what their temperature is and where they are at the moment, all manner of other surveillance state, implications. They want us to believe that restrictions on our freedoms is a necessary corrective to this problem that they unleashed. They want us to believe that our government should essentially hand out funding for us rather than us working for it, with all of the strings that go along with this. I mean, this is part and parcel of the Chinese takedown. And, you have to give the devil their due, as Tom Cotton talked about. If they actually thought not only that they could wreak havoc with our economy, they could terrify our people, they could sideline our military, at least in the Pacific, all without firing a shot.
Right.
Do you think that they would have leapt at the chance to do that? And I think they not only would have, but they did. And I think Tom Cotton is right to say that was deliberate. And I just would, one other seed I'd plant with you all, if you haven't looked at it, I commend to you the videotape of an exercise that was conducted in New York City in October 2019 called Event 201.
Oh, right.
Sponsored by Michael Bloomberg through his Johns Hopkins University programs, Bill Gates through his foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the UN Foundation, the CIA, deep state, the Federal Centers for Disease Control, and the Chinese Centers for Disease Control, in which they gamed out this tabletop exercise. And it's all there on the video. Don't take my word for it. Look at it yourself. They gamed out how the cause of global governance and funding it would be advanced by a coronavirus pandemic. Now,
weird coincidence.
Really coincidental that all the globalists and the communist Chinese were talking about how they could really prosper from this. But I would be very surprised if the Centers for Disease Control of China representatives who were involved in that day-long program didn't have their report back to the mothership, the Borg, I call it, in Beijing, take aboard insights from this exercise, such that when, let's just give it the best possible interpretation, somehow out of one of these labs, this not engineered virus got out and started laying waste to Wuhan. They were able to spring into action, figuring out how to take the most advantage of it, not just to buy up the world's supply of personal protective equipment and medicines that they don't control, but also how they could inflict maximum harm, particularly on this country and others, to their benefit. Jiu-jitsu, I guess you might say, of an adversity to great advantage.
So
and
if
that's
they
what
could
we're
take,
doing as we speak.
if they could take the lessons from 201, one would imagine that if one's goal as the CDC or any organization funded by the United States, one would hope that they would also take lessons from 201 to similarly prepare for such a bizarre eventuality should anything occur. It doesn't seem like that those organizations really had the best outcome for the United States at heart, or am I misreading things?
Well, you remember that famous line from Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, "What do you mean we, white men?"
Right.
Look, I think people like Bill Gates have been methodically preparing for this
Right.
and have in fact taken quite considerable advantage of it. This may have come to your attention already, but one of the things that Gates has been working on for some time is a vaccine technology that involves the insertion of nanochips,
Nanotechnology, right.
which can be used to record all kinds of health information, which then can be obtained involuntarily from a subject for the betterment of world governments or the public good as defined by
It's for our own good,
a
Frank. I can't
globalist
understand.
euthanagist
Yeah,
and population freak like Bill Gates. I mean, this is such creepy stuff that I think for most people they'd say it's a conspiracy theory probably, or worse. But the truth of the matter is, just look at the public record.
right.
And you'll see that some of these people have been taking advantage of this time to prepare. And honestly, some of them are in the Food and Drug Administration. Some of them are in NIH. Some of them have been working hand in glove with Bill Gates on a lot of this stuff. And
And it
that's
doesn't seem like
also
there's anybody on the freedom side, on the legitimate American side.
that.
Yeah.
Us.
Right?
Well, look, I mean, I think there are lots of people in this country who have been prepping. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
that's true.
But I don't think that there has been, again, this is a digression, but very quickly, I spent my formative years working on nuclear weapons policy. It was my portfolio in the Pentagon during the Reagan effort to defeat the Soviet Union. It was kind of a frontline position at the time, which is very interesting. But one of the things that I've been so impressed by over the years, and hardly anybody even knows this to be true, but Henry Kissinger, who is another of the villains of the piece, I mean, he was Larry Fink before there was a Larry Fink, and his malignant hand remains on policy and power in policy making towards China to this day, amazingly enough. But Henry Kissinger was one of those who created a policy of mutual assured destruction. He became one of those who championed the elimination of our missile defense system, such as it was, that got enshrined in the 1972 SALT I Accords. The so-called ABM Treaty was one of the two elements of it, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The reason I mention it, Karen, is because once we adopted the posture as a country that the most perfect defense condition we could be in was one in which we were perfectly vulnerable to attack. You had no ballistic missile defense, every missile would land and be devastating. Well, then why would you spend money on air defense, for example, or civil defense? And we've become so accustomed to having no responsibility at all, personally or corporately, for the civil population's protection, that I think it's created a condition in which thinking about, let alone actually investing very substantial sums, which is now needed, in preparedness against any of these kinds of threats is really not even in the debate, but it needs to be.
We're not, the economy obviously is being destroyed, which means one of the ripple effects is the military. The buildup that we had been taking on is going to be harder to justify in this climate. Do you think that was a deliberate goal as well? I know that we've talked about this, they wanted its dominance without firing a shot, right? But is the weakening of our military part of that?
That's a good question.
Without kinetic?
I don't know that it would be less justified or even less popularly understood as
Mhm.
needed. I just think it's going to be a lot harder.
Yeah.
I can't get my head around the hemorrhaging of money that we've undertaken here in the past couple of weeks. So it's going to be hard to come up with the cash, that's for
Right.
sure. But look, I mentioned the marginalizing of our sidelining of our military. There's, again, anecdotal, circumstantial evidence that American and other countries' navies have been peculiarly afflicted
Hmm.
by this disease. You've heard about the Theodore Roosevelt, one of our super carriers,
Hmm.
Ronald Reagan, another of them. A destroyer just turned up called the Kid recently, and several others, I believe, have been also affected. Usually after they've made port calls someplace. You know, this isn't the first time in history that sailors have caught something ashore, needless to say. But in Palau, an island that had no reported incidences of COVID-19, 3 Taiwanese Navy vessels made a goodwill visit back in March. And on their way home, suddenly guys started turning up with COVID-19. Now, could that have been simply coincidental? Could they have gotten it before? I don't know. But what I do know, and what the Chinese Communist Party knows, is those vessels are now inoperative
Right.
at a moment when China is very aggressively ramping up the pressure on Taiwan. In fact, I have to tell you, I would not be surprised at all if China doesn't go for it in Taiwan in the midst of all of this.
Right. Wow. Question from the chat room. The Epoch Times, and Chinese American Friends often referred to the Chinese Communist Party's internal struggle between Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping as fundamental to disabling the party. What do you understand about and best? What do you understand about it, and how can we best address the split between the Xiang faction in Shanghai versus Xi in Beijing? Are you?
Look, I don't think any of them are going to be particularly friendly to us.
Uh-huh.
How much there is really a rift there? I remember
Hmm. Hmm.
back in the Cold War, we endlessly were told about the hawks versus the doves, and
Right.
we had to help strengthen the doves and undermine the hawks, and that's what our strategy of engagement was all about. If we just help those doves show that, you know, we're people that they should want to do business with, and the hardliners would be marginalized. Oh, you hear it now about Iran too, don't you?
Right.
I personally don't buy it. I think Xi is plenty strong enough to deal with these sorts of internal
Hmm.
tensions. Are they there? Probably. Might we do something at the margins to help one side or the other? I don't know. But what I do know is the only hope that this is actually going to be improved, and it's a hope, not a certainty, even if you could pull it off, is that
Hmm.
the Chinese Communist Party actually falls, as it should. We ought to be working assiduously on policies aimed at doing that, just as they're working assiduously on policies trying to bring down Donald Trump
Right.
and for the rest of our country.
Well, before this happened, when we had our October conference on the global freedom movement, Hong Kong was the hot spot for freedom at that time, and there was a lot of discussion about maybe, you know, China's going to just go in and crush them, or maybe this is the thing that's going to bring down the Chinese Communist Party. There was lots of tension and excitement, and this really is the best front line. And then this happens, and it all kind of disappears. So, do you have any thoughts on how the timing of all of that? And what
Well,
happened
the
with
communists,
with the Hong Kong freedom movement?
yeah, the communists have a turn of phrase. It may be Soviet communists, but I suspect the Chinese have it with their characteristics, as they like to say, and that is, it's no accident, comrade.
Right, right, right. You've used
You
that
know,
to me. Yeah.
you may be, you know, unconvinced that the Chinese could have thought through all of the ripple effects for our
Mhm.
country that unleashing the Chinese Communist Party virus on us would entail. But they didn't have to be smart,
Mhm.
let alone cunning and strategically skilled, to have figured out that if they cause everybody in Hong Kong to have to be off the streets, that was going to be the end of this demonstration stuff.
Right. Right.
Something they couldn't accomplish with other techniques, but they did brilliantly with the COVID-19. And I think that, you're seeing the crackdown play out. It's still being done fairly surreptitiously and slowly, but we had 15 of the leaders of the demonstrations rounded up the other day. They'll all be tried and imprisoned in due course. They may be sent, who knows, out to the concentration camps in Xinjiang. We'll see. But
Right.
the trouble is that whatever one thinks about this disease and its provenance, I have to tell you, my working assumption is that it was engineered
Mhm.
in a bioweapons laboratory. And it probably got out, not intentionally, but I'm open-minded on that. We just don't know. We don't have enough evidence,
Mhm.
and we're unlikely ever to have enough evidence, I think, to say dispositively. But what you cannot deny, no one can, is the Chinese have seen in this experience a proof of concept
Mhm.
for biological weapons use. In fact, what I think Tom Cotton said in not quite as many words is the Chinese engaged in a biological weapons laydown on this country. Now, whether it was naturally caused or whether it was accidentally, instituted or whatever, the decision purposely to migrate people from Wuhan and other parts of China that have been exposed to this to other parts of the world
The world.
by hundreds of thousands
Right.
was biological warfare. Be honest about it. And the trouble is that their takeaway is a confirmation of something that, according to, this is one of the most chilling things that I've come across so far in all of this work that we've done. A fellow by the name of J.R. Nyquist published a piece in Epoch Times back in February. I think maybe end of January, beginning of February, in which he excised comments from a man who back in, I believe it was 1999, was the general, excuse me, he is general, but he was the Secretary of Defense,
Mhm.
Minister of Defense in China. And according to Nyquist's report, which I think surfaced first in the Epoch Times, and there'll be people who say, well, the Epoch Times is, an anti-Chinese communist thing, it's propaganda, but it sounds right to me.
Mm.
He described to a party cadre meeting in closed doors that Deng Xiaoping, that cute little fellow that I was telling you about, had back in 1991, I believe, or maybe 1992, instituted a biological weapons program for China in violation of their treaty commitments under the Biological Weapons Convention not to have a biological weapons program, in violation of their promise, to not stockpile or
Mhm.
otherwise experiment with these kinds of weapons. The purpose for this biological weapons program, according to this Minister of Defense, attributing it to Deng Xiaoping, was to use such weapons to depopulate the United States so that the excess population of China could be moved here to colonize this country. Now,
Lebensraum.
could
That is
that
the Lebensraum of Chinese.
indeed, could that in
Yeah.
fact be what we've just watched in sort of a dress rehearsal? I
Right.
don't know, but it sure, as I say, sounds right to me.
It's profoundly chilling. There's a couple of other questions in here. Do you think the world will get on board with the fact that this is a clear and present danger and fight? I guess first, are we on board? And second, I'm already seeing Japan taking action, but what about the rest? There's 5G being addressed in England and a handful of other countries saying, no, not here, but the big picture.
Yeah. Look, I think it depends a lot on leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we're prepared to lead, there are more countries around the world today, more people around the world today that are prepared to follow
Yeah.
than certainly was true a month ago, let alone 6 months ago or in recent memory. I mean, going back to what I said earlier, Karen, about this this business of the Belt and Road Initiative, there are lots of countries that are furious with the Chinese because not only have they done all the things that I talked about, but one other thing, they've imported all the workers to do the construction on these facilities. So most of these countries are desperately poor. They've got huge unemployment. They would kill to have their people trained and employed usefully and remuneratively. Hadn't happened.
You're right.
A friend of mine likes to say they brought in everything down to the cooks and prostitutes from China. And this has only fed the problem, of course, with the pandemic, because with those Chinese have come the diseases.
Right.
May have come anyway, but they've certainly been exacerbated by this. And beyond that, I think there's this sense that the Chinese are going to screw them financially and that they're going to dominate them.
Right.
It was not something they wanted to really sign up for, I think, in most cases at least. And so here's the point. I've been working with some incredibly creative people in the rubric of this Committee on the Present Danger China about how we can pivot out of this in ways that can not only help kickstart our own economy, but lift up the rest of the world's and essentially knock the pegs out from the whole Chinese, globalist colonial enterprise. And in the process, by the way, give the Russians fits over their efforts to dominate the natural gas market. So these are things that if we come out of this strong, if we come out of this unified, if we come out of this determined, not as Lyndon Johnson used to say, not just to get mad, but to get even. We have a big opportunity, I think, to pull in a lot of people behind us, and it's really vital for freedom.
I'm going to change all those ifs to whens when we come out of this strong, when we come out of this leading. Can you share one or two of the suggestions that you're making so that we can do exactly that? Empower others, take leadership roles. Are there things, or is it too undercover at this point?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it. This is a bit of an excursion, and I realize we're way over time here, but you're getting your money's worth.
If you have time,
I
we
do.
have time.
I
have
do.
time.
A colleague of mine, who I've talked to a lot with Deborah, as a matter of fact, talked about with Deborah, is a brilliant investor in strategic technologies, many of them in the energy sector. And one of the things that he has come up with is a means of exporting a lot of American natural gas, which we have in superabundance, and just can't get to markets. And basically, it involves putting platforms offshore where you can do the liquefaction of the natural gas at one end and the regasification at the other end. These facilities can be relatively small. They can be much more affordable than the big LNG plants. They can be offshore, so they're not as problematic environmentally and regulatorily. Right. And they can be financed in the private sector on the basis of the long-term sale of gas to sovereign nations. In short, it's a way to get inexpensive power to countries that desperately need it. And one of the other brilliant ideas he has is that power, fueled by inexpensive US natural gas, can be fed into a desalination plant that is adjacent to it. So you get both power and potable water. The quantities of water are just staggering. He says that the throughput is approximately per platform the amount of water that a city the size of Mumbai needs every day.
Oh my.
So these are the sorts of things that if they are made part of what I kind of think of as well, we've been calling it a U.S. Global Recovery Initiative, be extremely beneficial to a key sector of our economy, the energy sector, and jumpstart, the economies and enhance the quality of life
Right.
of people all over the world. And it would be so much more attractive to the countries at the other end than the communist Chinese model that I think they'd get blown out. So this is a work in progress. Excuse me, but promising.
Yeah, sounds excellent. There's a question in here. How do you feel about the instability in North Korea and its effect on the region?
Well, I don't know that there is any instability at the moment. There's evidently some uncertainty.
Better word.
If the uncertainty eventuates into instability, it'll be very interesting to see. My real concern, another friend of ours, Gordon Chang, has written a book about losing South Korea.
Right.
And one of the things that's very troubling is that the president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, was just very sizably reelected with a mandate that will unfortunately translate into his intensified efforts to reunify with North Korea on basically the North's terms.
That's one of the more shocking things that we've discovered. When we hear about rapprochement and all of this, it seems like, oh, yay, North Korea is softening, but in fact, the opposite is true. And
and it doesn't have to if it's not really under pressure. The Chinese prop them up, of course. The Chinese make it possible for there to be a North Korea, for heaven's sakes.
Right.
But when they don't have any pressure from the South, and our pressure, such as it is being undermined by the South, it means that you're likely to see more intransigence, more of the hard line. And whoever comes next, if Kim Jong-un is actually out of action, who knows? That is likely to be bad for the people of South Korea, among other things. Certainly our interests as well there, I believe.
Yeah, unification. It's not like Germany, where the East fell, where the communists fell. This is going to be the West and the freedom side falling, which is, should that occur, it's not an obvious, parades in the street, or our side. Another question, who or what were the sources for the original guiding philosophy or cover story that assured us that if we engage in trade and commercial relations to China, they are guaranteed to morph into non-communists? If we're nice to them, it'll all be peace, love, kumbaya, right?
Well, part of the reason for going through that excursion with you at the beginning about the Soviet Union was to say that this is not an anomaly. This is sort of a reflexive attitude on the part of elites in our country, that they know better, and that basically common sense be damned. They'll tell us how to do this for the betterment of the globe as they see it, which generally translates into the betterment of their deal, not so much everybody else's. But it just happens, going back to what I said about Deng Xiaoping and hide and bide and the new Cold War and all of that. The Chinese were just infinitely more adept than the Soviets were at figuring out how to exploit our greed, lack of national security mindedness, and more generally our short-sightedness about doing deals with people who are hostile to you and being indifferent to the dependencies that would be resulting from it, and the hollowing out of your own industrial base and the like. So I would personally be inclined to lay at the feet of Henry Kissinger most of this. he's had many helpmates, and particularly over time, as more and more people were able to enrich themselves in this process, he was hardly alone. But he was the architect of it initially under Nixon.
Opening China.
Maybe had some ideas of his own on this, but I think Kissinger was the guy who really took it and ran with it, and then profited personally immeasurably from it.
And is
to
still
the point where you're really looking at, I personally think treasonous activities, but for, among other things, personal enrichment.
You had mentioned in your talk earlier, and also on March 1st, about the gigantic amount of money spent by the Chinese in these really subtle influencing measures. Just even to say the Epoch Times is this, anti-commie rag that can't be trusted. That in itself seems to be a communist China in talking point, right? It's billions of dollars, trillions of dollars spent in little subtle influencing mechanisms.
I don't know, honestly, I don't know anybody who does, other than probably somebody in China, but it's certainly billions. Trillions is probably a little high, but billions for sure. But when you think about it, I mean, look, this guy in Harvard who was working for the Chinese under their 1,000 Talents program, I think got something like $50,000 a month in payments from the Chinese for doing it. That's a lot of money to a Harvard professor, but it's nothing to communist China, especially if I could leave you with nothing else, folks, especially when that's walking around money that we give them in these cash transfers from our capital markets.
Unbelievable.
It's us making it possible, and shame on us for doing that. But I've got to believe that the Chinese, well, they're not only contemptuous of us, but I think they must find us so unbelievably inept and incompetent to just further reinforce their sense that their victory is inevitable, which is a bad thing to be in conveying to them.
Right. Two questions. What do you think their greatest weakness is, and how can we exploit it? And then what do you think they're going to do next? And what can we do to prepare?
Well, I personally think that the greatest vulnerability is that they have a supply chain dependency. We're not the only ones who do. Their supply chain dependency is on our capital markets, from which they are seeking to extract another $3 to $5 trillion on top of the 3 or so trillion that they've already got. And that makes all kinds of things possible. As I say, it doesn't cost a whole lot of money to suborn people. It costs a bit more to underwrite your Belt and Road Initiative. It costs more to underwrite your military buildup. It costs a lot more even than that probably to maintain the kind of security state apparatus to control your own population. But that vulnerability is one that can be exploited. And again, part of the reason for taking your time on the Soviet thing is as a dear friend and colleague of mine, Roger Robinson, who helped Ronald Reagan implement that strategy that the Committee on the Present Danger China, excuse me, I keep saying that, the Committee on the Present Danger Soviet, if you will, fashioned. He points out that, going at the sources of cash flow for the Soviet Union was the decisive ingredient. There were other things. There was the military buildup. There was blocking their operations in Central America and Africa. And so there was the Strategic Defense Initiative, not least. But at the end of the day, I think he's right in saying that when the cash flow came to a screeching halt, because of, interestingly enough, think about this, at its core was a partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia to drop the price of oil to a point that bankrupted the Soviet oil and gas sector, and with it, the rest of the economy.
Mm-hmm.
You may have noticed that the Russians and the Saudis have been seeking to bankrupt our energy sector,
Right.
being essentially the same play. But back to China, if we were to do to the Chinese what Roger and Reagan and others were able to do towards the Soviets, I think that vulnerability could be exploited decisively and make a huge difference. And what was the second question?
What do you think happens next? What do you think they're going to do next, and if anything?
Their next move? Well, again, my working hypothesis is that the Chinese at some point, and it goes back to the question that we discussed a moment ago about the possible fractures within the party. My gut tells me that the Chinese will probably opt for what social scientists call social engineering, to try to assure the continuity of the party and its control of its own population and its further pursuit of the ultimate objective of world domination. And another factor is, in addition to the unhappiness that's been obviously generated towards the party by the way it handled this coronavirus business, is that one of its earlier policies, which has also had a devastating effect on the country, namely the one-child policy, which has resulted in, predictably, a situation in which, since most families are only going to have one child, they want it to be one that's worth something. Not my view, theirs, namely a male.
Right.
You now have, by some estimates, 40 million military-age men for whom there are no women. Now that is a huge social challenge, needless to say. And to the extent that at one fell swoop, you could create a solution to the underlying discrediting of the regime and the need to intensify its control over a restive population and get those military-age men out of the country and out from under your, your somewhat unstable party apparatus. War,
right,
may well be the next thing. Now, maybe it's a splendid little war, as I think they may think of it, and taking back Taiwan. Perhaps it's more expansive. I don't know, but it's very worrying that they've been arming to the teeth, as I mentioned. They have, in quite a number of areas now, capabilities that are able to surpass our own. They certainly have areas in which we are far superior, but the challenge has been that by their pursuing asymmetric capabilities to the things we're strong in, for example, aircraft carriers, they've got 2, I guess now, but they're building a bunch more. But for the moment, we have a greater capability there. But not if they're tied up in port.
Right.
Or not if they're unable to operate within proximity to China, because there are now long-range ballistic missiles capable of attacking them underway at sea. Carrier-killing missiles, they call them. These create conditions under which the Chinese may be calculating that they could do something quite audacious and get away with it, and get the country rallying around the flag because they've taken back this Taiwanese operation and showed the successful power of the Chinese Communist Party, and begun rolling back all of the insults that China has been subjected to over the years for being relatively weak militarily. So
Well, World War II
that makes
started.
up for, it's just sort of a working hypothesis about a series of things that might create a perfect storm. I hope I'm wrong.
Right. And they would have more will than we certainly do in that regard, which is
Will and capabilities. I mean,
Right,
look,
capability.
the point of all of this is we've got a global military challenge. They basically have a Western Pacific challenge. They've got a lot of forces that they've put into place to help them manage that challenge, and it's considerably more than we could bring to bear, even if we wound up moving lots of stuff and had the time and ability to do it into the Western Pacific. They'll enjoy a force advantage for some time.
Do you have the president's ear on any of this?
Oh, I like to think so. I was told today that the letter that I was telling you about,
Mhm.
signed by 134 people, got his attention.
Uh-huh.
And I'm hoping that that will translate into him doing what we think he has to do, which is to um, intervene and interpose the blocking action that will keep these funds going from the federal
Right.
retirement system into Chinese companies. We'll see. The nice thing about my job, Karen, as is true of you, we spend a lot of time just telling people what we think, and sometimes it actually gets to them, and
Right, right,
sometimes
right,
getting
right,
it
right.
off our chest.
Well,
Either way,
that is very heartening, though, that you probably do have his ear. As you know, we're hosting a conference. It was going to be next February, but we've moved it up to whenever we get the all clear, or we seize the all clear, which is maybe what winds up happening, on the topic of China. And very exciting. And we decided it would be a 2-day conference, right? What you covered in an hour to an hour, your slideshow. It's profound, it's broad, it's terrifying, it's information everybody needs to know. I'm excited to have you part of it, Gordon Chang, Steve Bannon, Bill Gertz, a number of, so I'm sure we will talk much more about who all we can resurrect the panel that you had on March 1st. People are aware that there's more that they need to know, and we're going to be happy, as you say, to tell people what they need to know. And then, as we always do, and as you always do too, information is great, but now what can we do about it? So can you point us to anything that we as individuals or as AFA, what role can we play? I know I will share this video and all of that, but is there anything else we can do?
we've scarcely scratched the surface of what you can do.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's always important to say you can support organizations like AFA and that are the Center for Security Policy, Committee on the Present Danger of China, as we're doing things that you want to have done. You all have circles of influence. I know that audience a bit, and I know you have the ear of people that matter. Some of them are philanthropists, some of them are talk radio show hosts, some of them are business leaders, some of them are people who are on editorial boards, whomever reach out to. Maybe it's just neighbors and friends for that matter, or family members, but whomever you can raise the awareness of and call to action, especially if they're in positions of power. I entreat you to do that. Things like this business with the thrift savings plan. There is an active firefight underway right now. We have a petition at our website.
Okay, I was just gonna. Good.
China. We have a widget that will allow you to call the White House or your Congress critter that will give you an opportunity to email them. We're trying to make this as easy as we can just to have you weigh in. And if you can do that, that's a help. Having, other platforms. Perhaps it's calling in radio shows, perhaps writing a piece that you submit to your editorial board. But things like, for example, weighing in on this. I mean, I have found without exception, we talked about this in March, I remember, without exception, when you take the abstract problem of our supply chain dependency on China and you reduce it to a discussion of, do you think it's advisable for us to be dependent on China for virtually all of our medicine?
Right.
You run the table, because there isn't anybody, whether they're in government, whether they're in the press, whether they're in business, whether they're, in academia, the pop culture, there isn't anybody whose life isn't touched, either personally or because of family members or others, business associates, by the fact that we take medicine, we take prescription drugs, we take generic drugs in some cases, but whatever it is, it almost all comes either in finished form or in components from unreliable and arguably dangerous Chinese suppliers. And boy, once you've got that message across, then it's an easier sell to say, we really need to decouple flat screens and chips and rare earth minerals and the manufactured products that are important to our lives. Those ought to be manufactured here, or at least in some place that's close at hand and friendly. And I think, again, just to sort of summarize, we talked about a lot of things, but I really believe, Karen, and I want to salute you for your vision and getting that thing off the ground in March. You did a wonderful job there putting this together.
Thank
the
you.
Other programs that you're going to be doing, the one that's coming up hopefully in the fall, hopefully before the election.
Yes.
We will see the fruits of these efforts, because the soil is tilled and fertile right now.
Yeah.
And planting these seeds about the fact that A, we need to do something, and B, the kinds of things that each of us individually and better yet collectively can do to make a difference is both extraordinarily opportune, I believe, but also perhaps our last chance.
Yeah. Chilling stuff, Frank.
Little. But I hope
one of the things I used to do, this is years ago, was department stores or buying appliances and make a point, all kinds of things, clothes, whatever, making a point to the people who work there, oh, I'm not buying this, it's made in China. It was just such an easy thing to do. And I think if we do a lot more of that, plus the point of supply chain, just speaking up, speaking out, it doesn't even have to be confrontational. It's very easy, and eyes are open, the soil is very fertile for those kinds of things.
There's a campaign I've heard about. I've not seen the product, but I'm told there's a campaign that would label things not made in China.
Oh, I like it.
Message across.
That's really terrific. Well, Frank, thank you so much. Really appreciate everything.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine as always.
And your contributions and taking all this time to talk with us. Much appreciated.
Happy to do it. Thank you for your listening and for the hosting of it. Karen, as always, you're a dear friend. And
our pleasure.
Work at AFA is extremely valuable as well, and I appreciate being able to support it.
Thank you. Just terrific. It's an honor.
Thank you. God bless you all.
And you.